Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're taking a look at the March 1924 issue of Weird Tales. Starting with the cover, where we can see they mention in very big bold letters that Houdini has a story in this issue, which is billed as the most miraculous true story ever written. And this is also the cover story. We can see Houdini all chained up the way he would often be for his performances, except instead of being on stage, he seems to be in some sort of jail cell in the company of a skeleton. Let's get into it and see what's in this issue. Again, the table of content is at the end, and it shows us that in addition to the true story by Houdini, we also have 16 pieces of fiction. So we'll go through it one story at a time. And the first story is The Spirit Fakers of Hermannstadt, which is billed as an amazing adventure of Houdini, written by Houdini. Although the little research I did seems to indicate it might have been ghostwritten. In it, he talks about being in Eastern Europe and being approached by someone who tells him that someone's using his name as part of a scheme to blackmail her and her family. He decides to go and to just tell people that what is being said about him is false, except that the people who are lying about him are much worse than he believes, and he gets tied up and thrown into a cell of this castle they're in. The person who approached him is apparently a countess. The episode ends with him just having escaped from the cell, leaving one of his captors unconscious there, forgetting to lock the door and trying to exit the castle. He is still, however, in handcuffs. He hasn't managed to get them off his wrists since the lock mechanism was broken. We'll find out what happens in the next issue. As an adventure tale, it was kind of fun, but I highly doubt its veracity. Though some details are sprinkled here and there, the dates of some of Houdini's performances, things like that, which would be easy enough to toss in to add a bit of verisimilitude. Next, we have The Hermit of Ghost Mountain by C. Franklin Miller. The story is told from the point of view of one of the protagonists, and essentially it is exclusively what the hermit of the title is saying to his visitor, a young man who apparently is a journalist. He talks about how he is much older than he seems. It's hinted at, but it's clear that he drinks blood, and apparently he has a recipe to keep him immortal by drinking blood, because blood is life. And the story ends with a little postscriptum, which is an extract of a newspaper story that appeared that makes references to the bodies of the young journalist and the other gruesome things that are found in the hermit's hut. I quite like the story, actually. It never states anything, it mostly hints at it. It might be a little bit obvious to someone who's had an extra century of this kind of fiction to pull from. That doesn't take away from how competently written and entertaining it was. This is followed by Justice in the Foothills by Clement White. This one concerns two prisoners who have been condemned to death. They are being driven to prison when the vehicle they're in falls over a cliff. Most of the occupants are tossed overboard, including them. Most people fall down to their deaths. The only reason they survive is because the two prisoners are cuffed to each other, and as chance would have it, they each fell on different sides of a tree that was growing out of the cliffside. They manage to climb out. They figure that their escape will not be known for quite some time, but they need to get away quickly. However, they can't break the chain that ties them together, so they keep walking together. One of them knows of a hermit. This seems to be the issue for hermits, that lives not too far from where they are, and they're hoping to reach the cabin of this hermit and that he could be convinced to break the shackles. However, just as they're about to be caught by some bloodhounds that were sent to catch them, the hounds stop because they sense another presence. And the other presence is a wolf, specifically a rabid wolf. And the dogs are smart enough to get away as quickly as they can. The wolf does attack the two men and bites them. They manage to fight it off and get it to run away, but they know they both will get rabies. As they make their way, they start to be suspicious of each other. Some paranoia ensues. And of course, one of them succumbs to the sickness earlier than the other, who manages to knock him unconscious. Forced to drag the unconscious body, makes his way to the hermit's hut. By then, the sickness has overtaken him too. The hermit sees the man, is terrified, grabs his rifle, and will shoot. As Adventure Tales goes, it's fairly good. First, you think it's just going to be an escape, but then you get that paranoia coming in, which one of them will succumb to the sickness first, what that will entail for the other, and can they get to the hermit's hut fast enough to get help from him? Another good story. So this issue's been fairly good so far. The next story is called Zilla by Val McClark. The narrator of this one is part of a crew. They all despise their foreman, who, on top of being a bad boss from their point of view, abuses his partner, whom the narrator befriends. She's the Zilla of the title. She tells him that her previous partner has found her after 6 or 7 years. She ran away from him and she knows he's coming. He sent her one of 2 earrings that she had left behind after running away. I'm going to leave it at that. The story ends with a confrontation between Zilla's 2 partners. There's no supernatural or particularly weird aspect to this story that I can see. It didn't do much for me either. It's just about a whole bunch of very unpleasant people. This is skippable if you decide to read this issue. We also have a poem called Hunger by Leonard Fohn, which is okay. It didn't really speak to me as much as some others have, though I've also read worse. So the next story is The Fine Art of Suicide by Howard Rocky. This one is about a newspaper editor who feels that people lack imagination when they attempt the act mentioned in the title, and comes up with a truly imaginative way of doing it because he's tired of having to make up or embellish real life in order to sell papers. Some of the people he works with believe he's just having a lark, and one of them dares him, well, then you should do it yourself to show people how it's done. He does. That's pretty much the story. There's a lot of time spent on all the gory details, which I don't really care for. It's more aiming to shock than horrify, if you ask me, and this kind of story doesn't work for me. For those who like that kind of stuff, though, I have to say it is fairly well written, so you might enjoy it, but I didn't. At the end of this story are also 2 very short poems. One, The Melancholy Pool by Clark Ashton Smith, which is another excerpt from Ebony and Crystal, and the other one called The Crystal Globe by Preston Langley Hickey. Both are fairly nice. I always like Smith's work. Next is Ashes by C.M. Eddy Jr. This is a tale of a man who is the assistant for a chemistry professor who is doing independent research and has come up with a substance that will turn everything it touches into ashes. Everything except glass, that is. This assistant is in love with and has asked a young woman who also works for this professor to marry him. He will come one day to meet her after work, and he goes into the lab where he sees her belongings and a very large pile of ashes and a glass coffin-shaped container filled with that strange liquid that will turn anything it touches to ash. Thinking that the professor has decided to experiment on a human, turned his fiancée to ashes, he gets enraged and fights the professor, eventually defeating him and getting rid of the evidence, if you will, by putting him in the coffin and turning him into these ashes. but he feels he must confess the thing to a friend of his. The friend says, well, do you actually know if she's dead? We need to go there and really investigate. You made some big assumptions. And sure enough, when they get back to the lab, they find that in a separate room, the girl is tied up. She reveals that the professor's plan was indeed to experiment on a human. He was going to use her as bait in order to get him to be turned to ashes. One of those stories that science fiction is full of, with some lone researcher finding some groundbreaking piece of technology, in this case a chemical product, and the consequences of this person being foolish and ignoring the ethics of his experiments. Quite enjoyable for the kind of tale that it is. Then we have The Rats in the Walls by H.P. Lovecraft. This tale is narrated by an American who is a distant descendant of some nobility somewhere in the UK. He will buy the ancestral home. He soon discovers that the nearby villagers really dislike the place, and they also, it turns out, really dislike his ancestors. When they find out his family history, they will begrudgingly accept him because it's evident he doesn't know much of the family history at all. He renovates the priory, which is on top of a cliff, but he still hears noises in the walls that he feels are like the noises of big rats. There is a story how centuries ago, thousands, if not millions of rats came out of there and rampaged the countryside, killing livestock, animals, even a couple of people before disappearing, and lots of strange things had apparently happened there. A friend will join him and they will start to investigate the noises. The main building is built on top of like Roman foundations, themselves built on top of Celtic or Druidic foundations, and themselves built on top of something even older. And as they go down into the basement and sub-basement, they manage to find like a secret door that opens up into a tunnel. And when they get into this large cave, they find buildings from various ages, skeletons of people, but also what seems to be pre-human simians. There is, of course, unspeakable horror, and when he is found, along with the body of his friend, everybody thinks that he has killed his friend, which he denies. Evidently he has, and now he is in an asylum where so many Lovecraft protagonists end up, and he can still hear the rats in the walls. So another good tale by Lovecraft. This tale is also the first mention, to my knowledge, of Nyarlathotep, the mad faceless god, and it does hint at how old and ancient he is. Next, we have The Voice of Euphemia by Eudora Ramsey Richardson. This one's narrated by a young man in college who is friends with a rather odd duck who comes from a small family who has an island plantation, and the woman he loves is from a nearby island where there's another plantation that her family runs. They will get married. They're very close. The narrator will visit them. Unfortunately, a while later, he gets a letter from his friend saying that his wife has passed away. He decides to visit his friend in order to be there in a hard time of grief. And he finds out that his friend will spend his nights listening to a wireless set, a radio, because his wife said that even after that, their bond is so strong that it will remain, and she will try to get in touch with him. And he's convinced that if he just listens hard enough with the radio, he will hear her voice again, which he actually does. At first, the narrator is doubtful, though eventually he has to bring himself to the evidence that they do hear the voice of the deceased wife. And then the narrator hears another voice, which is the voice of his friend's mother, who he has met in the past and who's also deceased. This voice will implore him to save her boy. There seems to be a conflict of some sort between the spirits, and then the voice of the wife comes in, calling her husband, telling him to come to me, and he will fall lifeless to the floor. An interesting story, really shows how radio was still quite new. The interest in the supernatural and ghosts was really big at the time, so it's kind of natural to want to combine the two. The next story is Yellow and White by George Fuller. This one's narrator talks about meeting an old college buddy from 10 years before and being shocked at how much he's changed. Apparently, he was in China for quite a long time, and he's taken on a lot of the looks and habits of that country. So eventually, as they spend time together, the old friend he remembers seems to be resurging. And he will eventually tell him that he married a Chinese girl that he met over there. He's still in love with her. He relates how he met her somewhere in the countryside. Her father is the priest in this temple where she also has a position. One of the things they do is burn this incense, which is made with these yellow flowers that he's never seen up close because they're only grown in temple grounds and places that he can't access. He says how when he talked about visiting the US again, his wife said that if he does, he wouldn't come back. For some reason, she didn't want to go along with him. She gives him a box and tells him that not if, but when he knows that he's not going to come back to open it. He mentions this to the narrator, and he says, I will open the box. And in the box, they find 3 of these strange yellow flowers. The petals are rather thick and waxy. They both look at them. The narrator decides to go home. Once he's home, he will wash up a bit before going to bed. Whenever water goes where he's touched a flower, he starts to bleed. And it's just a little bit on the tips of his fingers. It's not too bad, though it's quite surprising and obviously not a pleasant thing. And he will shortly after get a phone call, and it's from his friend. And the only words he can discern incite him to get a doctor. And he hurries over, he grabs a cab. They drive over as quickly as they can, grabbing a policeman on the way. The policeman breaks down the door. They enter and they find the shower still running. And his friend is near the phone where he collapsed. And even though he doesn't seem to be wounded, it seems he's been bleeding from all the pores in his skin. And he is now exsanguinated and obviously dead. So that was an interesting story. There's no real overshadowing of what may happen or of the sense of danger that could happen. I mean, they do say that the Chinese civilization is ancient and they have a lot of knowledge that modern technological society doesn't have. But beyond that, there's not much. It's also unclear why the main protagonist's wife would want to kill him if he doesn't return. Why he decides not to go back is unclear to me. A well-told tale, but a little disappointing. I mean, this issue has quite a few poems. This is another one by Leonard Fone called The Visit of the Skulls, which I liked a bit more than the previous one that was published a few pages previous. A fun little read, that one. I probably will do a short of it, and there'll be a link on the corner somewhere. Next is Coils of Darkness by Zilla Ramis. This is the second part of a serial that was started in the previous issue. This is set in India. In it, a young woman had been captured and then rescued. Since those events, her personality has greatly changed. However, she meets a young officer, they fall in love in spite of everything, and they will get married. While she is radiant and full of joy in life, most times she also becomes very listless and down and lifeless at times, and it's kind of unpredictable. Her husband ends up being quite upset. He thinks she might be cheating on him. Eventually he spies on her and he discovers that it's not another man she's going to see, it's snakes. And then she admits that the poison of snakes doesn't have the effect on her it has on most people. It acts kind of like a drug. They were talking about returning to England, which at first she didn't want to do, but her husband agrees that they can take some snakes with them back to England, but he will find a way for her to be freed of this curse, of this addiction. This part of the story was fairly low on action. It was mostly developing their relationship and her addiction, which I think was well done. once we find out what the cause of her mood swings and all that is, it kind of makes sense that she's addicted to something. What she's addicted to doesn't make too much sense to me, but I'm willing to let it slide. We'll find out in the next issue if she does manage to get rid of her weird addiction. Next, we have The Toad by Donovan G. Fitzpatrick. This is told from the point of view of a servant. His master is quite unpleasant. He hates him. He has fantasies of killing him. On top of that, the master keeps a pet toad, a huge creature the size of a cat or something. You can see the illustration. It's described to be about that size, and of course it's a toad, so not very attractive. He dreads it. He hates it just as much, and at one point he accidentally steps on it. His boss will attack him with a cane, and he will wrest the cane from him and kill him with it. He will then hide the body, and after a few days contact the police saying he doesn't know where his master is. And the police does investigate, but they don't find the body where he hid it in the basement. He inherits the house and everything, but he has to keep taking care of the toad. It's one of the conditions, which he kind of has to do, so he does. During a flood, where he hid the body is revealed, and as it happens, the police decide to visit him just because they wanted to check out the toad, and then he will confess to everything when from the flooded waters in the basement comes floating up the toad that had recently disappeared for a few days, carrying a skull. I didn't really like this story. Fairly standard murderer going a bit crazy because of some weird circumstances surrounding the victim. Next is The Statement of Archibald Swain by Berthan Peter Tom. This story is mostly a written account by someone who is in an asylum for the criminally insane. Talks about how what he's writing is to absolve someone from a murder that he was accused of committing, saying that he's the one who committed it. The catch is that the person who's in the asylum is the very person who he wants to absolve of the murder, while admitting he did it. And basically the story is all about how he used his knowledge of the fourth dimension to enter the body of Archibald Swain to kill someone who he feels had wronged him. As he's about to reveal how he did it, the account ends, and we see a note saying that shortly after the last few words were written, the person had a heart attack and died, that this is just the ramblings of a madman, and blah blah blah. Not particularly a bad story, but something we've seen before also. Next, we have the second installment of The Transparent Ghost. Which I said last time, I read a few paragraphs and had to stop because it's just so badly written, full of errors and spelling mistakes and all of that. So I'm just going to skip that one again. We're promised a third installment, which luckily is the conclusion in the next issue. Following this, we have another installment of the long-running serial Draconda. You may remember last time the heroes were about to be attacked by an angry mob because they interrupted a human sacrifice. So now we have the battle. Because they have firearms and because they strategically positioned themselves, they managed to win the day, or at least to push back the mob. Then they're approached by someone waving a white flag, and they're told that they will be brought to the Queen Draconda, as was initially the plan. However, the leader of the men who is guiding them will say, we're going to take a shortcut. We're going to go through these tunnels across the mountains. He lures them into a room which he will shut big stone slab, closing it off. They're trapped. Then the scene cuts to the queen herself, Draconda, who finds out what happened and is angry because she ordered that these strangers should be brought to her and not harmed. She sends some of her soldiers to go and recover them, so they're rescued. They will meet the queen, and as they meet her, it turns out she can speak English. Everything so far was done through sign language or demonstration. They weren't speaking with the Venusians, but apparently she can speak English, which leads one of them to conclude she must be from Earth and asking how she came to be here because they thought they were the first Terrans to cross the void and reach Venus. She says no, she was born here, but how she comes to speak English, we will find out probably in the next issue. Next is Creatures of the Night by A.P. McMahon. And this is the story of an academic who relates a story to a friend of his who's the narrator about a strange encounter he had one night in a park where he encountered strange otherworldly creatures. Nothing seemed to happen to him, though when he wakes up, he's in what appears to be a hospital bed, and his friend is there telling him that he should stop talking about these events, since people think he's crazy, and if he doesn't stop talking about it, he won't be able to get out of the asylum he's been put in. That's pretty much it. Somebody has a strange encounter, and they stop talking about it because they are thought to be insane. And now that his friend relates the story since it can't harm anyone anymore. I quite liked it. The creatures, we are not told what they are, they're simply described. It's a very moody piece and I really enjoyed it. This is followed by The House in the Forest by Harold Ward. This is narrated by a detective who is asked by an old friend of his who's the mayor of a small town to please investigate a strange death in the county the town is in. During a picnic, a young woman wandered off and she was heard screaming. She is found dead, her throat torn, she's bleeding. There are no footprints or any signs of who her attacker might be. While the mayor is off to go see his old friend, the private eye, another similar murder happens and the investigator starts to look into it. He decides to go to the scenes of the crime. However, no one's really willing to accompany him, so he goes alone. Seeing a storm is coming, he decides to hurry back, but he loses his way until he finds a house in the middle of the woods. He's reluctantly welcomed by the old couple who is there, and he will eventually discover that the murderer is a large ape man of some sort that they keep with them. They used to be part of a circus, and the exhibit of the ape man was what they were running. And when they left the circus, the man didn't want to leave his creature with the circus. However, it's become more erratic and violent as time went on. They can't quite control it. It managed to escape to those murderers. And the reason no footprints were seen was because it brachiates through the trees instead of walking on the ground. Murders in the Rue Morgue, but out in the boonies. You can't see the solution to the murders coming, but the story is quite well told, and there's a bit of private eye action when, as he's being attacked by the ape man, the detective will pull out his gun, shoot it, and so the detective manages to survive, though just barely. A fun little story that combines the noir private eye, the strange occurrences, quite typical Weird Tales story. And then we have another masterpiece of weird fiction, and again it's a tale by Edgar Allan Poe called Never Bet the Devil Your Head. This is not quite as good as the other Poe tales. Most of the other stories by Poe that we've seen before were probably ones that everybody was familiar with. I'd actually never read this one. The narrator's friend who will bet the devil his head, he's a rather foul-mouthed person and he will always say things like that. Until at one point he says, "Oh, I bet the devil my head I could jump over these turnstiles that are near a bridge." This strange gentleman in a suit will tell the narrator's friend that he should then do this, jump over the stiles. He will fail the jump. It looked like he was going to clear it. He falls on the ground without having crossed the stiles. The old gentleman seems to grab something, hide it under his coat, and run off. And when the narrator gets to see what's happening with his friend who's not getting up, he sees that he's without a head. And it turns out there were some thin steel beams that were holding up the structure of the bridge as he jumped, one of those beams hit his neck, cut off his head. And then the tale goes a little bit weird as the narrator says he rushed him home and tried to apply some homeopathic cures to his problem. However, this all failed and his friend passed away. The last couple of paragraphs are very strange and they really go off into left field. I don't understand what was happening there. And I didn't like this story as much as everything else I've read by Poe. Finally, we have the Eerie. In addition to the standard set of letters commenting on previous issues and stories and such, we also have the announcement of a new section called Ask Houdini, where people can write in questions about the supernatural. They will select the serious ones, the ones that seem to be worthy of response, and they will publish Houdini's answers to these questions. Clearly some sort of collaboration between the magazine and Houdini, I guess both trying to capitalize on the other's success. Houdini, I know, was writing books at the time, so maybe that was a way to expand the sales of those books, and Weird Tales, of course, wanting to capitalize on the famous escape artist. And that's it for this issue. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, looking at the March 1924 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.